At the headquarters of a major commercial bank in the heart of downtown Manhattan, I sat quietly in the priority waiting area, wearing the most basic outfit possible. My name is Mavis, a 28-year-old woman who has spent the last decade building a life entirely independent of the toxic shadows of my past. As I waited for my appointment, Bernice appeared out of nowhere while clutching a designer handbag that I knew for a fact was rented just to impress the bank tellers. She looked down at my simple jeans and t-shirt with a sneer of pure disgust before claiming that I was clearly sitting in the wrong section because this area was reserved for people of actual substance. Bernice began boasting about the massive multi-million-dollar financing she was about to receive, which would finally secure her place among the city's elite social circles. I am about to secure a massive amount of funding, so I really do not need any of your petty spare change, she whispered with a sharp and condescending tone. I did not bother to argue with her or defend my presence in the VIP lounge because I knew exactly what was hidden within the bank's internal database. Instead of speaking, I simply reached into my pocket and placed my matte black Centurion card onto the cold marble table between us without making a sound. Cynthia, the senior teller who was busy collecting Bernice's messy pile of paperwork, suddenly froze mid-motion as her eyes locked onto the embossed gold numbering on my card. A heavy and suffocating silence filled the lobby as Cynthia carefully picked up the card and walked straight toward the manager's office without uttering a single word to either of us. Bernice started to look visibly unsettled as she shifted in her seat, while trying to maintain a fake and shaky smile to mask her growing confusion. I leaned forward slightly and asked her with a calm voice if she was truly certain that her fraudulent loan application was going to be approved today. If you want to see how Mavis turns the tables on her arrogant sister and exposes the truth behind this family's lies, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for the next part of this intense journey. 5 minutes passed in a heavy and suffocating silence, where the only sound was the sharp and decisive ticking of the bank lobby clock. The atmosphere felt thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to push everyone else back into the shadows of the grand hall. Cynthia finally returned from the inner offices, while accompanied by a tall man dressed in a sharp black suit, whose presence immediately commanded respect. Their professional demeanor had shifted from standard courtesy into a state of absolute and profound reverence as they approached our table. Bernice deliberately stepped forward to block my path while attempting to ask about her pending loan application with a forced sense of entitlement. She was met with a cold and stony silence, as both officials looked right through her as if she did not even exist in that space. I reached out to take my card back from Cynthia before standing up with a deliberate calmness that clearly unsettled everyone watching. The man in the black suit, whom I recognized as Mr. Harrison, the senior managing director of this specific branch, gestured for me to follow him. We began walking toward the restricted area of the building where the private elevators were reserved only for the highest level of executive leadership. Bernice threw a deeply suspicious and confused glare in my direction while she stayed behind at the marble counter. She immediately started pestering the remaining staff members with frantic questions about my true identity and why I was being treated like royalty. I simply offered her a faint smile and a slight nod of my head just before the heavy gold elevator doors slid shut. The quiet hum of the elevator as it ascended toward the 50th floor felt like the beginning of a long overdue reckoning for my family. I knew that within those executive offices, every single one of the secrets Bernice had been hiding was already waiting on my mahogany desk. For a decade, I had lived as a ghost to my parents and my sister, while they built their fragile empire on a foundation of lies and borrowed prestige. They had convinced themselves that I was nothing more than a failure who had disappeared into the vastness of the city without a trace. Little did they know that while they were busy posing for social media, I was acquiring the very institutions that funded their extravagant lifestyle. Mr. Harrison remained standing near the control panel while maintaining a respectful distance that reflected our professional hierarchy within the Capital Crest organization. He informed me that the internal audit team had already flagged several significant inconsistencies in the real estate portfolio Bernice had submitted for review. My sister had been playing a very dangerous game by using our parents' home as collateral without their legal consent or knowledge. She assumed that her connection to Grant Miller, who had recently joined the credit department, would be enough to bypass the standard verification protocols. Bernice had no idea that her husband's career was already under intense scrutiny due to his own fraudulent credentials. As we stepped out into the expansive glass-walled hallway of the executive suite, I could feel the weight of the power I now held over their future. I instructed Mr. Harrison to prepare a comprehensive report on every transaction linked to the Miller and Bernice accounts over the past fiscal year. We entered my private office where the city of Manhattan stretched out below us like a shimmering map of opportunities and consequences. I sat down in my leather chair and looked at the thick manila folder that contained the evidence of their ultimate downfall. Every fraudulent signature and every inflated asset value was documented with a clinical precision that left no room for excuses or mercy. The silence of the office was far more powerful than any of the screaming matches we had endured before I was kicked out of the family home. I spent the next few hours meticulously reviewing the financial trap that Bernice had set for herself while trying to outshine me. It was clear that she was desperate for the upcoming loan to cover a massive deficit in her failing boutique brokerage firm. She had gambled everything on the hope that I would never return to witness her humiliation or challenge her authority. I closed the folder and looked out at the skyline while realizing that the game of shadows was finally coming to an end. The time for hiding my success was over, and the time for delivering a hard lesson in reality had officially begun. 8 o'clock in the evening arrived as Manhattan drowned in the glow of extravagant neon lights. But my mind remained trapped in the bitter moment of being kicked out of the house 10 years ago. Back then, my parents had forced me onto the streets with absolutely nothing to my name, and I realized now that it was the single greatest mistake this family had ever made. I stepped into the penthouse owned by Bernice, where she was busy preparing a pretentious party to celebrate the supposed career success of Grant Miller. The air inside was filled with the smell of expensive catering and the hollow laughter of people who valued status over genuine human connection. Grant Miller spent the first hour of the evening bragging about his new position at Capital Crest, while looking at me with a mixture of pity and arrogance. He eventually approached me with a smirk and handed me a glossy brochure detailing the instructions for opening a basic entry-level credit card meant for low-income earners. I took the paper from him without saying a word, while noticing the glaring inconsistencies in the business reports that Bernice was proudly presenting to the guests. She was parading around the room while claiming that her boutique brokerage was on the verge of a historic breakthrough in the luxury real estate market. Mavis, you should really learn how to watch successful people and live accordingly, instead of remaining someone who always stays on the sidelines of society, Bernice whispered as she leaned in close to me. I simply watched her while she sipped her champagne, because I knew that her entire world was constructed from a deck of cards that was about to collapse. Grant Miller began a long and boring speech about the importance of financial discipline and how his new authority at the bank would change their family's fortune forever. He had no idea that I had already spent my afternoon reviewing the digital evidence of his fraudulent credentials and the forged signatures on his wife's loan application. The gathering felt like a theater of the absurd, where everyone was playing a role to hide the desperation that lay beneath their expensive designer clothing. Mom and Dad sat in the center of the room, while beaming with pride at the daughter they believed was their golden ticket to a permanent life of luxury. They barely acknowledged my presence except to remind me that I should be grateful that Bernice had even invited me to such an exclusive event. I remained silent while observing the way Bernice laughed, because I could see the subtle tremors in her hands as she checked her phone for bank updates. This coming Monday, I am going to show you exactly who holds the real power in the center of New York, Bernice declared with a firm and unshakable confidence as she raised her glass for a final toast. I did not bother to argue with her or point out the flaws in her logic because I preferred to let the cold reality of the financial markets do the talking for me. I simply took a slow sip of my wine and waited patiently for the final day of judgment that was only 48 hours away. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming as they treated me like a charity case while I was currently the one deciding whether they would keep their home. As the party continued into the late hours, I sat in the corner and watched the guests celebrate a victory that was never actually going to happen. Grant Miller continued to give unsolicited financial advice to anyone who would listen, while Bernice made grand promises about future investments that she could never possibly fulfill. I realized that my family had become so blinded by their own vanity that they could no longer recognize the difference between a real opportunity and a dangerous lie. I left the penthouse shortly after midnight without saying a formal goodbye, because I knew that our next meeting would take place in a much more formal and unforgiving environment. The city lights seemed to shine brighter as I walked toward my car, while feeling the weight of the mahogany folder in my mind. 9 o'clock on Monday morning arrived as the heavy oak doors of the Supreme Conference Room at Capital Crest opened with a sharp and decisive motion. Grant Miller was already sitting in the executive chair at the far end of the long mahogany table, while confidently flipping through the fraudulent loan documents for Bernice. He looked up with a smug expression as several board members took their seats, clearly believing that his promotion was a settled matter. I walked into the room with a steady pace and ignored the guest seating area entirely as I headed directly toward the empty chairman's seat at the head of the table. Grant Miller froze in disbelief and accidentally dropped the thick manila folder onto the floor right in front of the gathered shareholders. His face turned a sickly shade of pale as he watched me pull out the chair that represented the highest authority within this entire financial institution. "What on earth are you doing, Mavis? This seat is not meant for someone like you," he shouted while scrambling to pick up his scattered papers. I did not offer him an explanation or move an inch from my position as the room fell into a stunned and absolute silence. Instead, I calmly placed my personal identification and a certified summary of my controlling shares onto the polished surface for everyone to see. I officially established my control by making it clear that I held a large enough stake to oversee every single operation within this global banking system. The shareholders began whispering among themselves as they realized that the person they had been waiting for was the same woman Grant Miller had tried to belittle. I signaled for the technical assistant to activate the main projection screen, which immediately displayed the evidence of Bernice's massive financial fabrications. The forged signatures and the fake property valuations were highlighted in bright red to ensure that no one in the room could ignore the blatant criminal activity. I watched Grant Miller's hands begin to shake as the digital records proved that he had actively helped Bernice bypass the bank's security protocols. From this very moment, I am the one who decides who gets to stay and who must leave this building forever, I declared, with a voice that carried the weight of a decade of silent preparation. I immediately issued a formal order to freeze the entire approval process for the loan application submitted by Bernice's real estate company. The board members nodded in agreement as the sheer scale of the attempted fraud became apparent to everyone present in the conference room. Harrison walked in through the side entrance while accompanied by 2 members of the internal security team who stood ready at the door. I instructed them to revoke Grant Miller's access to all bank servers and to escort him out of the executive suite without any further delay. He tried to protest and claim that there was a misunderstanding, but the evidence scrolling across the screen made his excuses seem pathetic and hollow. The atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to a cold and professional realization that a new era of leadership had officially begun. I sat back in the chairman's chair and looked at the empty space where Grant Miller had been sitting just moments before his world collapsed. The documents he had worked so hard to forge were now nothing more than evidence in a criminal investigation that would soon destroy his entire career. I realized that the years of being underestimated had provided me with the perfect cover to build this empire right under their arrogant noses. There was no need for dramatic shouting or emotional outbursts, because the cold and hard data had already delivered the final blow to their ambitions. I looked at the remaining executives and informed them that we would be conducting a full audit of every department to root out any remaining traces of corruption. The power I held was no longer a secret kept in the shadows, but a reality that would now dictate the future of this entire family. I felt a sense of calm victory as I realized that the first step of the reckoning was complete, and that the consequences for Bernice were only beginning to unfold. Manhattan stretched out behind me through the floor-to-ceiling windows as a reminder that the city always belongs to those who are patient enough to own the truth. 10 o'clock in the morning arrived as the news of the permanent loan rejection hit Bernice like a death sentence delivered without any prior warning. The financial lifeline she had spent months manipulating was officially severed by the board of directors under my direct supervision. Down in the main lobby, Bernice came charging into the building while screaming my name at the top of her lungs, but the security team refused to let her pass the front desk. She looked desperate as she tried to shove her way through the turnstiles while shouting that everyone would be fired once she spoke to the leadership. It was a pathetic display of a dying ego that no longer held any currency within the walls of Capital Crest. Grant Miller was placed under immediate suspension and forced to hand over every single piece of company equipment, including his encrypted access badges. He stood in his office while watching the IT department remotely wipe his credentials from the internal bank network in real time. The Internal Investigation Unit had already been activated to uncover what appeared to be a systematic financial fraud involving multiple high-value accounts. Every transaction he had ever authorized was now being scrutinized by a team of experts who did not care about his excuses or his family connections. He looked at the empty space on his desk where his professional life had existed just a few hours ago, while realized that his reputation was ruined forever. Bernice realized with a mounting sense of panic that the high-interest predatory loans she had taken to maintain her luxury lifestyle were coming due immediately. She had no source of income to cover the massive deficits in her boutique firm because she had gambled everything on the approval of this fraudulent bank funding. "I demand to see Mavis right now. Do you people not realize that I am the sister of the president of this institution?" She shrieked at the security guards who remained completely unmoved by her outbursts. I stood on the top floor while looking down through the glass at the chaos unfolding in the lobby several hundred feet below my feet. The sight of my sister desperately arguing with the guards was a stark contrast to the smug woman who had mocked me at the party just 2 nights ago. "You are no longer a member of my family since the moment you decided to forge my name on those legal documents, Bernice," I muttered to myself as I watched her break down through the security monitors. For the first time in 10 years, I saw an absolute and heavy silence fall over the face that had always been filled with nothing but arrogant pride. She stopped screaming and simply stared at the elevator doors while realizing that the person she had treated like garbage was now the one who held the power to destroy her. I instructed Harrison to ensure that the police were notified of the forged signatures so that a formal criminal record could be established against both Bernice and her husband. The investigation was no longer just an internal matter because the scale of the attempted fraud had crossed the threshold into a serious felony. Bernice began pacing the lobby floor while frantically dialing numbers on her phone, but I knew that none of her high society friends would answer her calls today. They were like vultures who only circled around those who had money, and they would be the first to vanish at the first sign of a financial scandal. I sat down at my desk and authorized the release of a memo to all departments regarding the new security protocols and the termination of the Miller accounts. The mechanical process of her downfall was moving much faster than I had originally anticipated because her entire empire was built on nothing but hollow lies. I felt a strange sense of calm as I watched the security team finally escort Bernice out of the building and onto the crowded streets of Manhattan. The first stage of the reckoning was complete, and the reality of her choices was finally beginning to settle into her shattered consciousness. She was now just another stranger in the city, with a mountain of debt and a trail of crimes that would follow her for the rest of her life. 2 o'clock in the afternoon arrived as Dad and Mom appeared at my office while looking for a confrontation rather than a peaceful family visit. They did not come to check on my well-being, but instead arrived to demand that I restore the rights they believed I had stolen from Bernice. My father paced across the expensive carpet while accusing me of being a cold-blooded child who had destroyed the career of Grant Miller and ruined the future of my own sister. Mom stood by the window with a look of pure betrayal as she claimed that my greed had finally poisoned the last remaining bonds of our family. I remained completely silent as I listened to their harsh words, because I was waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth that would shatter their illusions. I slowly reached into my desk drawer and pushed a thick forensic audit report toward them, which proved that Bernice had used their family home as collateral for several illegal high-interest loans. The raw and naked truth of the situation caused Mom to collapse into a nearby chair as she realized that her favorite daughter had actually pushed them toward homelessness. Dad picked up the documents with trembling hands and began reading the forged signatures that Bernice had used to put their entire life at risk for her own vanity. The silence that followed was far more painful than any of the shouting as the reality of their daughter's betrayal finally began to sink into their hearts. Bernice began calling my phone repeatedly while her messages shifted rapidly from aggressive threats to desperate pleas for my forgiveness in her hour of misery. I informed them that I had already made a decisive move to purchase the debt on their house from a third-party lender to prevent it from going into immediate foreclosure. This meant that I was now officially the legal owner of the apartment they had lived in for the past 30 years of their lives. Are you really planning to watch your own parents be thrown out onto the street, or do you still have a shred of humanity left in you? Mavis, Dad asked with a voice that was barely more than a broken whisper. I looked him directly in the eyes and explained that I was not the one who had destroyed this family, because I had simply stopped saving people who were busy digging their own graves. Everything they had believed about their social standing and their golden daughter was now lying in ruins on the floor of my executive office. I made it very clear that while I owned the property, I would no longer be providing them with a free ride while they continued to defend the person who had betrayed them. I requested that they leave my office immediately and begin taking personal responsibility for the catastrophic mistakes they had enabled over the last decade. Mom tried to reach out for my hand, but I pulled away because the time for emotional manipulation had long since passed for all of us. They walked toward the elevator with slumped shoulders while looking like strangers who had finally realized the true cost of their favoritism and their blind loyalty to a lie. The weight of the power I held over their future was heavy, yet it felt like a necessary burden to finally bring some form of justice to our family dynamics. I sat back in my chair and watched the city skyline, while realizing that the empire Bernice built was nothing more than a hollow shell that I now controlled completely. My phone continued to buzz with more frantic messages from Bernice, as she realized that her parents could no longer protect her from the legal consequences of her actions. I instructed my legal team to finalize the paperwork that would ensure that every penny stolen from the bank would be recovered through the liquidation of Bernice's remaining assets. The reckoning was far from over, but the second stage of the collapse had successfully dismantled the support system that had allowed Bernice to flourish at my expense. I felt a strange sense of peace as I realized that for the first time in my life, I was no longer the victim of their toxic expectations or their constant disappointment. The office felt quiet and professional as I turned my attention back to the business of running the institution that they had once told me I would never be good enough to join. Tomorrow would bring a new set of challenges, but tonight I would sleep, knowing that the truth was finally out in the open where it belonged. 6 o'clock in the evening arrived as the luxury facade officially crumbled when the police cars pulled up in front of the rented penthouse where Bernice lived. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the expensive glass windows while signaling the end of a long era of deception and borrowed prestige. Grant Miller began packing his belongings in a frantic rush while throwing a set of divorce papers at Bernice to escape any further legal responsibility for their shared crimes. He looked at her with a cold and detached expression, while declaring that he had no intention of going to prison with someone so incredibly foolish. "Are you really planning to abandon me after you promised that we would enjoy this glorious wealth together forever?" Bernice shrieked while clutching a designer bag that was no longer hers to keep. Grant Miller did not even pause his packing as he replied that her supposed wealth was nothing but a fragile web of lies built on a foundation of fraud. He walked out of the door without looking back and left her alone to face the mounting consequences of their failed schemes. Within minutes, the authorities began sealing every piece of expensive jewelry and every designer handbag to serve as compensation for the long list of angry creditors. Bernice stood in the center of the living room while watching the life she had carefully curated being categorized and hauled away in cardboard boxes. The family members who had once championed her success began to turn their backs on each other as the full scale of the betrayal became impossible to ignore. Dad refused to even look at the face of his daughter because of the horrible deception she had practiced regarding the legal ownership of the family home. He realized that the person he had prioritized for 10 years was the same individual who had nearly put him on the street. Bernice stood completely alone among the piles of furniture that had been discarded onto the sidewalk because the landlord had already terminated her lease. She tried to call her former friends and business partners, but realized that not a single person was willing to pick up the phone for a disgraced socialite. What scared her the most was not the loss of her money, but the total disappearance of the successful identity that she had spent a decade building. I monitored every single moment of this agonizing downfall through the building's high-resolution security cameras while sitting in my quiet executive office. There was no overwhelming sense of gloating or joy in my heart as I watched her empire dissolve into the cold night air of Manhattan. Instead, I felt a gentle and profound sense of liberation as the weight of my past finally began to lift from my shoulders. The person who had once enjoyed making me feel small and insignificant was now a ghost of her former self while wandering aimlessly through the wreckage of her lies. She had become a stranger to the city that she had once claimed to own by right of her hollow status and fake accomplishments. The silence of the penthouse was a haunting reminder that every choice has a consequence that eventually catches up with those who believe they are above the law. I watched as Bernice sat on a lone suitcase on the sidewalk while the cold wind of the evening blew through her disheveled hair. She looked at the passing crowds with a desperate hope that someone would recognize her and offer a hand of support, but the world simply moved on without her. The city of New York is a place that celebrates winners, but has absolutely no mercy for those who fail as spectacularly as she did today. I closed the laptop and walked toward the window while realizing that the final chapter of this reckoning was nearing its inevitable conclusion. The darkness of the night seemed a little less heavy now that the truth had been spoken and the debts had been collected in full. I knew that the road ahead would be quiet and perhaps a bit lonely, but it would be a life built on a foundation of honesty rather than a mountain of deceit. Bernice was no longer my sister or my rival, because she was simply a cautionary tale about the high cost of vanity and the price of betrayal. I turned off the office lights and prepared to head home while knowing that the person who had once been cast out was now the only one standing tall. Dawn of a new day began as I stood on the balcony of my apartment while looking down at the city of Manhattan transforming in the early morning sunlight. The golden rays hit the glass skyscrapers and reminded me that every dark night eventually gives way to a clear and bright beginning. I made the firm decision to convert the old family home into a community support center, which effectively ended all my remaining connections to a painful past. This building would no longer be a monument to greed or favoritism, but would instead serve as a place of hope for those who have nothing. I felt a profound sense of relief as I signed the final transfer papers, because I knew that the cycle of toxic family dynamics had finally been broken. The final confrontation took place in a quiet courtroom where Bernice sat with her head bowed while the judge read the sentence for her serious economic crimes. She looked like a shadow of the woman who had once claimed to be the queen of the New York real estate market. There were no cameras or luxury handbags to protect her from the harsh reality of the legal system and the consequences of her vanity. I walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon breeze without feeling any need to say a single word to her or the lawyers. The silence was beautiful because there were no more abusive phone calls or constant pressure from people who only knew how to exploit my hard work. True freedom does not come from having an endless supply of money, but from having the absolute right to choose who is allowed to appear in your life. I realized that the decade I spent in exile was actually the time I needed to build a fortress of character that no one could ever tear down. I walked toward the entrance of the central bank with a completely different aura, while noticing that the staff immediately recognized me without needing to see a black credit card. They opened the doors with a level of genuine respect that had nothing to do with my bank balance and everything to do with my reputation. My journey from an outcast to a leader was complete, and I finally felt like I belonged exactly where I was standing. The story of Mavis and her family serves as a powerful reminder that true respect is earned through integrity and resilience, rather than through deception and flashy displays of wealth. Greed acts like a slow poison that eventually destroys the very foundations of the families and empires it attempts to build. When we prioritize temporary status over genuine human connection, we risk losing everything when the illusions finally shatter under the weight of the truth. Bernice believed that she could manipulate her way to the top by stepping on the people who loved her, but she forgot that a life built on lies has no ground to stand on. In the end, the greatest victory is not found in seeking revenge, but in achieving the freedom to live an authentic life on your own terms. Thank you so much for following this intense journey of betrayal and redemption until the very last chapter. Your support and engagement have made this storytelling process incredibly rewarding for me as a creator. What do you think about the choices Mavis made in the end, and would you have handled the situation differently? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, because I would love to hear your perspective on this family drama.
Trước khi khép lại câu chuyện đầy sóng gió ngày hôm nay, các bạn đừng vội bỏ qua vì có lẽ mỗi chúng ta đều nhìn thấy một phần bài học dành cho riêng mình qua hành trình của Mavis. Câu chuyện là lời cảnh tỉnh đanh thép rằng địa vị giàu sang chỉ là lớp bọc tạm bợ nếu đó được xây dựng trên sự dối trá và lòng tham không đáy. Trong cuộc sống ở Mỹ hay bất cứ đâu, giá trị thực sự của một con người không nằm ở chiếc thẻ đen hay danh xưng hào nhoáng, mà nằm ở đạo đức và sự tử tế trong cách đối nhân xử thế với người thân. Bernice đã đánh mất tất cả khi coi tình thân là công cụ để trục lợi. Để rồi khi ánh hào quang vụt tắt, thứ chị ta nhận lại chỉ là sự cô độc và bản án lương tâm. Đôi khi, sự trừng phạt tàn khốc nhất không phải là mất đi tiền bạc, mà là nhận ra mình không còn ai để quay về. Nếu đặt mình vào vị trí của Mavis, liệu bạn có đủ cứng rắn để cắt đứt hoàn toàn với những người thân độc hại như vậy? Hay bạn sẽ chọn một con đường hòa giải khác? Hãy để lại bình luận phía dưới về cách xử lý của bạn hoặc chia sẻ quan điểm riêng về câu chuyện này nhé.